Welcome to this episode of Kilted Therapist. This evening, you see that I've got some maps here to look at. In 2009, is that right? No, it had to have been more recent than that. I participated in Eco-Primal Quest, which is a 10-day adventure race challenge. But I got to go back into the Wayback Machine to remember when we did this. I was a part of a team out of Battle Creek, Michigan. Kathy Roche Wallace, her husband, a firefighter, and Kathy's daughter. And I was part of the support team in that. And this 10-day adventure race was supported. It was an amazing place to be in the Gallatin Mountains in Montana. Now, you notice that the title of today's episode was Subconsciousness. I've got a 1924 book called Applied Psychology by Ewer, and I'm going to read from page 41 because I was thinking about this particular topic recently, and you'll see how this ties into the adventure race here in a minute. Sources of the idea of subconsciousness, its scientific status. This is on page 41 on the chapter 3 of subconsciousness. The concept of subconsciousness has played a peculiarly important part in the development of applied psychology. In the popular view, indeed, it is the dominating principle of the subject. Mental and physical marvels, as well as less striking phenomena of everyday life, are attributed to the activity of the, quote, unconscious mind, unquote. It serves to explain strange occurrences in hypnosis and trance. It is commonly regarded as the agency of, quote, clairvoyance, end quote, and, quote, thought transference, end quote. Facts and fancies, without number, find a home in the mysterious but capacious concept. In a more chary fashion, and that's spelled C-H-A-R-Y, that's a word I've never seen before, it is accorded recognition by the psychological profession. It appears sparsely in the pages of standard textbooks and conspicuously in works on abnormal psychology, though its role has too often been that of a superficial pretense of knowledge and even of harmful superstition. It nevertheless possesses scientific value, and accordingly, our next task must be to examine it. Its roots are found in a pre-scientific era of mental culture. In the primitive experience of mankind, certain phenomena of human life gave rise to the vague hypothesis of a soul somewhat distinct from the self of ordinary observation. Mysterious powers of intelligence and strange forms of behavior, dreams, visions, and trances, what we now term hyperesthetic perception, and apparently telepathic communication, automatic action of various kinds such as paroxysms of singing and dancing, insane deeds, and the like, all called for interpretation and led to the superstition that the normal waking mind is only a part, and comparatively an unimportant part, of the human nature. Beyond, it seemed to stretch a realm of intelligence and will which worked wonders. To understand and use these mysterious powers was the art of the magician, the soothsayer, and the priest. Religion and philosophy developed in much detail the concept of a soul underlying and transcending the limits of ordinary experience. This invisible entity was regarded as the bearer of one's essential character, the source of conscious powers of moral judgments and religious faith. Psychology, the roots of which are found in part in religious thought, naturally took over this hypothesis, and though it was ultimately discarded as irrelevant to the purposes of the science, its influence continued in the psychological acknowledgement of a subliminal realm of the mind. In addition, certain lines of theoretical speculation about the relation between the mind and the body, and still more widely, between mind and matter in the universe at large, tended to enlarge the concept of mental life beyond the limits of actual consciousness. The latter, it seemed, must find its explanation in some non-material reality, an unconscious or subconscious mind. Now, I'm going to stop reading for a minute there. If you're at all familiar with the neuroscientist Sigmund Freud, he talks about id, ego, and superego. And he's used the unconscious mind, or what he calls that lower state of mind, to demonstrate several aspects of where he terms psychosis. We don't think of psychosis in exactly the same way today. At least the DSM seems to have kind of taken it in a slightly different direction. And I realize I'm kind of riffing there when I say that, but pay attention to this, because I think this is important to see how we have kind of moved in a much different direction when it comes to our understanding of science and what we believe is the subconscious. And I'm going to read just a little bit more of this, and then I'm going to tell you how this relates to an adventure race. Let's see. Most effective in establishing the concept were the abnormal phenomena connected with the practice of hypnotism, especially trance, visions, and automatic performances. The peculiarity of these manifestations appeared to place them beyond the range of explanation in terms of the known laws of mental action, and to suggest the operation of the mind on another level and with extraordinary faculties. In popular psychology, the term subconscious retains this vaguely metaphysical character, i.e., it stands for a mysterious entity or power which causes strange occurrences in human life. Though the laws of its action are unknown, the word affords a verbal explanation of any otherwise unexplained mental fact. Now, stop and think about this. This was written in 1924. Now, having been a hypnotist, having been hypnotized, and as a practitioner who regularly uses NLP in my therapy practice, I'd kind of taken some things for granted here. I had kind of taken for granted that subconscious exists. I also take for granted that people can access that state of mind, because, again, I had always thought of it as a state, as a part of the mind that one can access infrequently, except when we're lost in thought. Because hypnosis, as you've seen me demonstrate in other videos, and if you watched Severed Conscience, you heard me talk about the states that the brain is in and how they register as a hertz in terms of electricity. So I'm rethinking some things here as a result of some of this information. And it goes on to say, to the subconscious are attributed marvels of perception and information, hypnotic trance and multiple personality, the cure of disease, and the reformation of character. All this without a clear understanding of the process involved. In this half-light of knowledge, superstition and fraud have had an inviting field, of which they've taken advantage to such an extent that some psychologists are inclined to repudiate the term altogether. As in other departments of science, however, crude and superstitious ideas led eventually to more precise and workable ones. The subconscious, carefully defined, became a respectable psychological concept. Subconscious functions were definitely related to those of normal consciousness, and their shadowy, fearful character was dispelled by the light of investigation. Those who now use the term in the field of scientific psychology do so with clarity, yet much misunderstanding and nonsense remain attached to the term, and accordingly, to its students' first duty to avoid the popular superstitious usage of it, excuse me, and to comprehend its meaning in a definite psychological way. In order to do this, let us note some of the varied phenomenon which are included by the term. Properly conceived, as we shall see, it is a valuable interpretive and constructive idea. Now, the book goes on to talk about a variety of subconscious facts. Those subconscious facts, it says, are in normal everyday mental life many facts of sensation and perception which may properly be called subconscious. Thus, we are vaguely aware of sights, sounds, pressures, and the like, which are not in the forms or in the focus of consciousness, but which are more or less discernibly in the field of conscious field. Oh, that was confusing. Let me read that again. Thus, we are vaguely aware of sights, sounds, pressures, and the like, which are not in the focus of consciousness, but which are more or less discernibly in the conscious field. Objects seen with the tail of the eye, the faint murmur of distant voices, or the ticking of a clock, the pressure of clothing, the temperature of the atmosphere, the slight muscular strain and relaxation of breathing, the total bodily feel, termed choanesthesia. These and other items of mental content must be distinguished from the clear center of conscious process. They may be brought into focus instantly by increasing the intensity of the stimulus, pressure, for example, or by merely calling attention to them, but ordinarily they fade into the marginal blur of the mind's awareness and remain there unnoticed. This is interesting because when I was a young police officer, I read the books Street Survival and Tactical Edge. And the point of them was to tell cops how to stay safe and stay alive. Now, recently, I also watched a short bit of video between some tactical operators who were talking about decision-making under stress and the need for more training. When I was a young patrol officer, reading Tactical Edge and Street Survival, I paid very strict attention to self-hypnosis, which at the time I understood merely as visualization. And then later, I came to see it in an entirely different light as a result of going to see a hypnotherapist after being involved in a shooting. But here's why this is salient to the adventure race that we did. The adventure race was 10 days. You're not getting a whole lot of sleep, and even as support staff, we weren't really getting a whole lot of sleep. The weather conditions were interesting, to say the least. At that time, Montana had record snowfall, so the Gallatin River was well above flood stage. In fact, the day before the race, I was on the river faceboarding. Me and Kathy's husband, 2 wetsuits, elbow pads, shin guards, knee pads, helmet, swim goggles, and swim fins, and where you're laying on a boogie board going down what is now a class 5 set of rapids on your face. And it was so much fun. I didn't want to get out. If it hadn't been for the people from the state there shouting at us, I was ready to go again. I know I'm silly that way. But the point of this is the state of mind that I was in, even though my teeth were chattering, the water was cold because it was icy snow runoff, even in July. The water was specifically from the snowpack, because there was still snowpack. In fact, they were dynamiting areas of the trail and parts of the Gallatin Mountain to get snow cleared away so that these teams could compete on this course. It's a 600-mile course. I think there's still some videos on YouTube that you can see to kind of see how this goes, because there's a significant number of challenges in this course. And I'm going to keep referring to the Primal Quest course for this reason. It's kind of like a Wim Hof approach to meeting adversity, and you don't know where that's coming from. And the point of the subconsciousness is we can convince ourselves of a whole lot of things. I was fortunate when I lived in San Diego. I had a brief conversation with a guy who said that he was a Navy SEAL. And one of the things that he talked about was mindset. And I said to him, just out of curiosity, I just asked, I said, how did you manage the cold, the uncertainty, and the fatigue? You know, you're doing all kinds of crazy things during those evolutions. How did you manage that? And he said, alcoholics talk about minute by minute. He said, it wasn't even minute by minute. He said, it's everything that you can do to shift your focus to something that is so much less painful. And that's what got me to thinking about subconsciousness, because I was reminded of that looking at some old pictures of our Eco Primal Quest race. I remembered that there were people who, after about 2 or 3 days, were hallucinating and saying, I imagine that there was a Big Mac available, on the top of a mountain in the Crazies. It's a mountain range in Montana. But where does that come from? And what exactly is the subconscious? How do we use it? How does it show up? And like I said, modern theory is that we've accepted that this is a part of the brain that is accessed, that holds memory, and it's kind of like a storehouse. But I'm going to argue that in 1924 they had a slightly different perception, because he says, secondly, the complex processes which involve association, especially memory, imagination, reasoning, point to a subconscious realm of the mind. Now, if we think about that for just a minute, this is really fascinating. How many times have you heard, not just therapists, but TV therapists or supposed experts in any number of situations that talk about your unconscious mind? In my last video, I even mentioned your unconscious mind. We access things in that region quite regularly. And if we think about it in the terms that they're describing here, complex processes which involve association, memory, especially memory, imagination, and reasoning as a realm. So when we think about what does that really mean? And when we think about how does it come into conscious memory? Now, I've delivered therapy, and there's a wonderful episode that Marissa Peer did I give her all the props, because she talked about a whirlwind and using the whirlwind kind of like a Hoover to clean up some bad things that had happened for some people. But in that, what she's accessing is a state that is below consciousness. Now, when you've gone to see a stage hypnotist, what they're doing is they're taking you into a state outside of your conscious awareness. You're aware all the time of what is going on. Everybody that I've ever hypnotized, and even myself, I was aware almost all of the time of what was happening around me. Now, sometimes, though, I would get into such a relaxed state, I would fall asleep. And I don't know how the, the therapist worked with that, but we did. She was a far more skilled therapist than I was in that regard, and that was her specific specialty. So she had more specific knowledge in that arena. But here's the thing. When I'm doing light hypnosis and suggestibility with neurolinguistic programming, what I'm doing is I'm inviting the imagination to step in. Well, where is the imagination housed? And see, all this time, I assumed that it was in the conscious mind, that it was something that we just manifest in those moments when we need to create mental pictures, mental sounds, mental movies that have feeling. But, looking at this, because it also talks about the fact that data is taken in, and this reminds me again of Tactical Edge and Street Survival, because the guys that wrote both of those also talked about something that I've seen, from even as early as the book that I'm reading from, people that had applied these principles to manifestation or law of attraction. Now, I'm not suggesting law of attraction with this. What I'm saying, though, is that everything begins with a thought, because we know from rational emotive behavior therapy and from significant studies in the intervening 100 years since this book was written, that a very profound thing happens in the body. We can manifest change all day long. It's a question of how are we framing the information and then encoding it and storing it. Because when we're making a memory, it's interesting. My good friend, Mighty Human Z, shared a story with me about skiing and breaking his ankle. And he had shared that story before, but this time when I was reading it, I was thinking about the subconscious, because in his mind's eye, as this event is unfolding, as he's having this episode, he's not thinking in terms of fear, which is what the last video was about. He was angry because he'd lost control and because the situation was now no longer within his immediate grasp reach. But what his brain was doing was also taking in information, but it was also concealing information for his survival. Now, having been a police officer, I'd seen a number of significant events with people where their brain, actually, I was at a car crash. I was still a law enforcement explorer at the time, out here west of town in my hometown. The guy broke his ankle, got up and started walking around on it. When they asked him to sit down, he said, no, I have to go get, I forget now all of the circumstances, but he said he had to go get something. But in that process of saying that he had to go get something, he fell. And then he looked at his foot and screamed bloody murder. Now, this is a guy who had already walked about 20 feet on that broken ankle. And then suddenly realized that the ankle is broken and it hurt, because he's doing damage the whole time he was trying to clomp on that to move. So, he's doing even more damage. But the sudden realization that there was something wrong broke through that wall that his brain had erected in order to try to protect his psyche and protect him in that moment. Now, he got the help that he needed, and as memory serves, he survived, which is brilliant. So going back to Primal Quest, it's very inconvenient and uncomfortable circumstances, and the whole time you're doing it, you're thinking, why in the world am I doing this? This is absolutely stupid. You're mountain biking, you're hiking. I mean, you're doing a lot of hiking. You're mountain climbing, you're rock climbing, you're glissading down ice packs off of the top of mountains. In fact, the first day at Montana, once you left the starting line, it was the equivalent of doing a triathlon, because it was the same distance to climb to the top of the mountain, glissade down the other side, and you're doing it as quickly as you can. And then when you get to the other side, there was a mountain biking piece. There was supposed to be 2 water pieces, in rubber duckies. Basically, the thing turned into a dualathon. It was basically hiking and mountain biking. There was some climbing and some rappelling, but the snow and the conditions there, and it's July in Montana. So, but the point of that is you're very uncomfortable, but you're still putting your feet forward. You're still doing everything that you know how to do, but you also have to be able to read a map. You have to be able to navigate and orient. You've got to know when to stop to take on some rest. I love Robin Benincasa. I talked to her twice, once in Utah and then, no, not Utah. It was in South Dakota. Yeah, it was in South Dakota and in Montana. And then subsequently, when I moved to San Diego, I ran into her somewhere and just said, hey, how's it going? She's a brilliant speaker. Yeah, great motivational speaker. This is a woman who ended up having both hips replaced and still went out and did these amazing adventure races. And, looking at that, I'm thinking, what are the mental images that she prepped herself with to be able to make that possible? How does one garner those resources? And I think this book does a brilliant job of explaining it, because imagination. But if we go back here, when it says about the psychosis, and it talks about some of the other peculiarities of manifestations, about the subconscious, but it also talks about hypnosis. Now, there's something that was known as psychic surgery, and I had read quite a bit about this when I was at Liverpool, because there were a lot of people during the latter part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s, when they were really experimenting with hypnosis, were doing something called psychic surgery, teaching people how to excise wounds and tumors, all kinds of things. But the interesting thing, it was all through a self-generated movie inside of the person, wherein they're seeing with their mind's eye inside their own body in order to effect healing. Now, there's anecdotal evidence that a number of these people were very successful, and sometimes the people that were leading them in that psychic surgery were successful. To what degree, I don't know, because again, this was over 100 years ago, and there's no way to verify some of that information. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people who are still practicing this, because if we look at some cultures, they still very much practice a form of hypnosis, and they still approach the subconscious. Now, this book goes on to say, and you're going to love this, likewise, imagination, both in its ordinary and in its artistic forms, appears to well up from some obscure depth of mind. Dream and fancy seem often to reveal a deeper stratum of our mental being than the surface along which they pass, and just what, psychologically speaking, is poetic inspiration. What are the resources of the musical composer? So much greater than he himself is clearly aware of possessing. Many an artist has borne testimony of the strange way in which the works of the genius flash into his mind with a compelling force of their own. Whence do they come? The easy answer is the subconscious, the working and tendency of which may even be felt before the conscious illumination arrives. Further, there are the cases in which a process of rational thought is worked out subconsciously, perhaps during sleep. Excuse me, I'm going to point to something that happens here. And the name of the author escapes me in the moment, but it'll come to me. And if you know it, please put it in the comments. There was a writer who, during the 1930s, 1950s, in that era, had been writing books about manifestation of genius and had interviewed Thomas Edison. And one of the quotes from Edison in the book, as I recall, now this isn't verbatim, again, because it's been probably 10 or 15 years since I looked at this book, but as I recall, what Edison said was, sometimes I would look at a problem and study it from as many angles as I could, then I would take a short nap while I was thinking about the problem. Do you hear how he's accessing the solution? Now, contrast that with my second favorite book, How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, 7 Steps to Genius Every Day by Michael Gelb, written in 1994, and I think it's HarperCollins was the press. Michael talks about the fact that da Vinci would employ a similar practice. he would study something, and then what he would do is he would examine it in as much detail, both with his imagination as well as with his physical senses. And he talked a lot about intuition. Could he be talking about the subconscious and the access to the unknowable? Now, you may have also caught on to the fact that the book talked about telepathy and telecommunication. If you followed Sean Ryan at all, and I highly suggest that you do, one of the people that he talked to was Joe McMoneagle. He's also talked to a couple of other guys, the Third Eye Spies guys, who for the CIA were doing remote viewing. Wouldn't it be interesting to know more about the psychological aspect of remote viewing? Now, when I was in undergrad at Ferris, I had an instructor in one of my classes who talked about the use of remote viewing, but he called it out-of-body experience. So, there's that. Where does that come from? And it says here, further, there are the cases in which a process of rational thought is worked out subconsciously, perhaps during sleep, so that a solution to the problem toward which the thinker had struggled in vain flashes suddenly before him. It's a common experience to, quote, sleep on, end quote, a difficulty and waken with a clearer view of the matter. There are also well-authenticated instances of the solution of problems involving a high degree of mathematical or other technique in the subconscious condition of sleep, so that in the morning the fortunate worker found himself in conscious possession of the answer or method of operation. In the third place, feelings and emotions are characteristically sub rather than clearly conscious. I'm going to stop there for a second. I was sitting with a client, and it occurred to me because a course that I'm taking right now talks about identifying emotions with clients. And if you've heard me talk before about Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's book, How Our Emotions Are Made, I think it's really kind of poignant for us to begin to examine what exactly is an emotion. Because when I ask clients to identify what they feel, now, interestingly, I still get a lot of clients that Dr. Google or they'll TikTok their symptoms. But the expression that they give to what are otherwise considered common ailments, i.e. generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, depression, these things have a tendency to have the same descriptors. But when I probe people more deeply, and from my own experience, unless I'm in chronic freeze, which I suppose that's possible, but I don't think it's very likely. I think oftentimes we're not aware of what emotion we're feeling, but I think that the thinking process must have some access to the otherwise unseen process. Because occasionally, when I'm talking with clients, they'll pop off with something that's totally unexpected, specifically around things like anxiety and depression. Because depression is a low mood. Now, sometimes it involves sadness. Sometimes, not always. Here's the other thing. There's a withdrawal that happens sometimes with both anxiety and depression. But the fact is, not everybody is suffering from anxiety and depression. Often, people are frustrated and disappointed because they have an expectation of an outcome and it doesn't manifest. That's not depression. We get caught up in trying to label things to give it meaning so that we can better navigate a number of situations. Now, I'm not dismissing anybody who has all of the symptoms or, at least 6 of the symptoms of depressed mood. And I don't think of people as depressed. I don't think of people as anxious. I think these are people who do behaviors in those camps, and sometimes those camps overlap. But I think that people do a lot of behaviors in a lot of other contexts that we wouldn't necessarily categorize as depression or anxiety. Sometimes we're really struggling and troubled, and we're hurt because other people don't follow through, because we don't follow through. There's some guilt, there's some shame. There's a number of variables that can contribute to this. And this is how I'm going to tie this back to the expedition. Not every team wins. I know that's hard in a society that celebrates everybody getting a trophy, and the rules have all I don't know, gotten really weird in the world. But here's what I want you to understand. The people that don't win, when they get to the finish line, the same people that an hour before were saying, I don't know why I'm doing this. This is crap. I'm never doing this again. I hurt. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I think I just saw a polar bear. They're truly looking for an escape from an uncomfortable situation. But then as soon as they get within sight of the finish line, they're excited. We did it. And a lot of that stuff that was in the back fades. And I'm going to use my personal experience of having done a half marathon in Lansing. I trained. I'm not a runner. If you've seen me, I'm not a runner. I occasionally like to run. And when I am doing it regularly, I kind of enjoy it. More so because of what it gives me a chance to kind of get out of my head. But I noticed that the day that I was running, I started to have a conversation with a guy who was training for the Chicago Marathon. He was going to be doing the whole, but he was running alongside me, and we were having a great conversation. I couldn't even tell you now what we were talking about, but I really enjoyed talking with him while I was running, and it made it much easier for me to run. Well, guess what? If I am in hyperesthesia, I'm not feeling that pain, because hyperesthesia is much like anesthesia. Your mind is in a different place, and the focus isn't on the musculature that says, girl, quit. Just stop. All right? I think there was someplace back there that looked like someplace you could stop. No, because you keep going. And then when I got done, I crossed the finish line. In fact, there's one picture of me. I did a race, another Montana race. I had done some damage to my quads, and here I am trying to run through this. It wasn't Tough Mudder. It was a Spartan race. And when you see the picture, I'll put the picture on here so you can see my face when I crossed that finish line. I was in so much pain. But as soon as the race was over, I felt fine. All that pain in my thighs was gone. So let me finish this up here because I don't want to go too long. So it goes on to talk about turning the field of distinctly abnormal psychology. We observe everywhere signs of mental functioning, which must be differentiated from that of ordinary consciousness. Now it goes back to the hyperesthesia, anesthesia, amnesia, transvision, and audition. Again, I'm not sure how they're using that word, but I'm imagining there's something auditory happening. Automatic speech and writing. This was something that was popular, particularly in certain Viennese circles when Freud and Jung were talking with their clients. In fact, Freud's daughter, talks about this automatic speech. Sometimes people would be speaking what sounded like an entirely different language. It's the same with automatic writing, and Edgar Cayce is a guy that did the automatic writing. Hypnotic performance and the strange phenomena of multiple personality all bespeak a secondary form of mentality, more or less systematic and comprehensive in structure and function. The subliminal self, in its fuller development, appears to have its own focus and margin of awareness, its own impulses and emotions so separate from those of normal life as to deserve another designation. Since, however, these abnormal facts, when studied in detail, show distinct resemblance to those of normal experience to which we have applied the term subconscious, we may properly extend the latter to cover them. There you go. So, I invite you to draw your own conclusions. The conclusion that I'm drawing, and I could be way off the mark here, and I'm happy to hear your feedback. There's a lot about the unconscious that we probe pretty regularly. There are thousands of studies on the unconscious trying to understand how to make it work. Performance psychologists, motivational psychologists, the field of sports performance, motivation, neuroscience is constantly looking at this and how to improve this field and this facet of the mind in order to engage more fully and to increase productivity and efficacy. So what does that all mean? Well, an awful lot of time and energy has been expended to try to understand a phenomenon called subconscious. It's still a little bit nebulous. And I think I can say that with reasonable certainty, because I think there are still parts of it that are untapped. Again, that's my anecdotal experience. you may have a different experience, and I'm happy to hear from you if you do. It says here, general concepts of subconsciousness. How shall these various phenomena be conceived? What general types of conceptual explanation may we apply to them? The answer to this question is threefold. That is to say, the facts range themselves in three groups, closely related but of somewhat different character. In addition, there's a fourth concept of the subconscious, which is very commonly held, but which is dubious in terms of scientific acceptability. The first is physiological subconscious. Let's see, the second is marginal subconscious. I'm not going to read this whole thing. The third is dissociated subconscious. Really what this says is not conscious. Thus far, then, subconscious means not conscious, not physiological, or less conscious, marginal. A further meaning is found in the facts of mental dissociation. The mind is systematic in structure and function, i.e., part is related to part by links of memory, habitual associations, general tendencies of thinking, characteristic inhibitions, and the like. Incidentally, recently there was a study, in fact, I think there was a spate of studies that indicated that there's no such thing as muscle memory. However, somewhere in the realm of the unconscious is something that reaches into a memory and spurs activation in the body. If we look at rational emotive behavior therapy, we have a thought, quadrillionth of a second later, we have an emotion, and there's usually a behavior tied to that emotion. Something to think about. And then the fourth here says the unconscious mind. In addition to the foregoing meanings of the term, there is another which is commonly designated as the unconscious mind. According to the concept, the mind is divided into two parts, the conscious and the unconscious. The latter lies below the threshold of awareness like a vast, dark, uncharted sea of powerful mentality, not identical with brain process, and perhaps independent of this. Wouldn't that be something? Because it also says it's a great storage reservoir of mind, occasionally spouting some part of its contents up above the surface, but for the most part, pursuing its ways in the dark. Its incalculable behavior constitutes the source of much of our everyday life, but more especially the phenomena of abnormal psychology, dreams, trances, and mental disorders of one sort and another. Its powers correspond in a general way to those of the conscious mind, but operate without consciousness or with a form of consciousness which is peculiarly their own. These powers are usually, though not always, believed to transcend those of the normal mind and to include ability to foresee the future, excuse me, to send and receive telepathic messages, and to communicate with the dead. That's in a scientific book. So I'm going to put that book aside and talk for a second. Imagine that you're the guy writing this book or one of the contributing authors. That's kind of astounding, isn't it? Well, we're going to spend some more time in another episode further plumbing the depths of the subconscious, because how this ties to trauma, depression, anxiety, and what are typically labeled as mental health, I'm going to call them disorders or dis-eases. I'm specifically calling them dis-ease, not diseases, because there is no biological connection there. And I'll argue that one. The science is very clear. There's not a biological. A lot of this starts in the gut. So I guess you could argue that this is biological. But the thing is, there is not a gene for depression. However, what is interesting is somebody outside of the field of psychology did a study. This was a multi-generational study back about maybe 8 years ago. It was a woman in LA. I think she was Stanford. I could be mistaken on that. If I can find it, I'll try to include it in the notes on this. But what she'd uncovered is that during the Civil War, there were people who prospered and people who didn't. Generationally, she could look at the people who didn't prosper during the Civil War and after, and showed that there's a pattern of behavior that was consistent, which I think is kind of fascinating. And maybe we'll talk some more about that in another episode. Well, that's what I've got for you. Like I said, I'm going to put some pics up here of what Primal Quest is, what it looks like. It was a lot of fun. I love adventure racing. I've done a couple of Spartan races. I've never done a Tough Mudder. I've done Xterra mountain bike races. I really enjoy those kinds of things. If you get an opportunity and the weather's good, let's get outside. This is Kelly, the Kilted Therapist. Thanks for coming along. I'll see you next time.